Close your eyes for a moment and let the day begin to drift away. Imagine yourself lying in a quiet room where the lights are dim, the air is still, and the noise of the world has softened into silence. Tonight, we are not in a rush. Tonight, there is nowhere you need to go, no task waiting to be done, no weight to carry. There is only the sound of a story, slow and steady, ancient and timeless. A story that has been told for thousands of years beneath the stars, a story whispered around fires, painted on the walls of temples, and carved into the memory of humankind. It is a story from the Greeks, a story of gods and mortals, of darkness and renewal, of sorrow and love. It is the story of Hades and Persephone. Before we enter that story, let us take a few slow breaths, as if preparing for a journey. Inhale deeply, as though filling your lungs with the warmth of springtime air, and exhale slowly, as though releasing the weight of a long winter. With each breath, feel yourself sinking deeper into calm, deeper into the safety of the present moment. For the tale we are about to explore is not hurried, nor harsh. It unfolds like the gentle opening of a flower, petal by petal, revealing hidden truths in its own time. The Greeks lived thousands of years ago, yet their myths live on as if woven into the very fabric of the human soul. These myths were more than just stories to entertain. They were mirrors of life, explanations for the mysteries of the world, and gentle companions for those who sought comfort in knowing that even the gods experience struggle. Among these myths, one tale stands out for its quiet power, for its lingering sadness and beauty. The tale of Persephone, the maiden of spring, and Hades, ruler of the underworld. When we think of the underworld, we might imagine something frightening, a shadowed place filled with echoes and loss. But in the Greek imagination, the underworld was not a punishment for all. It was simply a destination, a realm of stillness and rest, where the shades of the dead lived on. Hades, its ruler, was not always a villain. He was a necessary guardian, a keeper of balance, one who ensured that the living and the dead remained in their rightful places. Persephone, by contrast, belonged to the fields above, where flowers blossomed and life renewed itself each year. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest, and in her presence the earth flourished with beauty and abundance. The story we will share tonight is the story of what happened when these two worlds met, when light was pulled into shadow, when innocence encountered inevitability, when the turning of the seasons was forever explained by a bond between a daughter, her mother, and the god of the dead. Yet we will not tell it in haste, nor with violence, nor with fear. We will tell it gently, as if speaking to a friend at the end of a long day, as if letting the mind drift slowly down a quiet river. As we prepare to begin, imagine standing at the edge of a wide meadow at dusk. The sky above is painted with soft hues of pink and violet, fading into the deep blue of approaching night. A warm breeze carries the scent of wildflowers, and in the distance you hear the faint trickle of a hidden stream. This is the world of Persephone, the maiden before the tale begins. And beyond the horizon, beneath the earth itself, lies another world, a realm unseen, waiting, timeless. That is the world of Hades. We stand between them now, on the threshold of myth, ready to step through. What you will notice as this story unfolds is how gently it weaves between themes of life and death, light and darkness, sorrow and joy. The Greeks told this tale to explain the seasons, why the earth blooms in spring, ripens in summer, fades in autumn, and sleeps in winter. But they also told it because it speaks to something deeper in the human heart, the need to accept change, the inevitability of loss, and the comfort of renewal. So let us step quietly into the myth, not with fear, but with curiosity. Let us follow Persephone as she gathers flowers, unaware of the fate that awaits her. Let us see Hades, not as a monster lurking in the shadows, but as a lonely ruler waiting in silence. Let us watch Demeter's grief spread across the earth, and let us find, at the end, a balance that speaks of both endings and beginnings. As you listen, allow the words to carry you gently. Allow them to slow your thoughts, to soften the edges of the day, to guide you into stillness. This is not a tale that demands your effort, only your presence. The myth itself will do the work. You only need to drift along with it, like a leaf carried by the wind. And if at some point your eyes grow heavy and sleep begins to claim you, that is perfectly all right. For myths, like dreams, live on whether we hear every word or only catch fragments. Now, the gates of the underworld begin to stir. The meadow waits in bloom. The story is about to begin. Before we walk deeper into the tale of Persephone and Hades, let us pause for a moment, as though standing at the threshold of a vast library, filled not with modern books, but with scrolls, carvings, and whispered words passed down across centuries. To truly understand the story, we must first place ourselves in the world of the ancient Greeks, for it was their imagination, their questions, and their beliefs that gave life to this myth. The people of ancient Greece lived in a world that was both beautiful and uncertain. They saw the rolling seas, sometimes calm and glittering beneath the sun, sometimes violent and unyielding during storms. They saw mountains rising like the homes of giants, rivers that nourished their fields, and forests that whispered with mystery. They felt the rhythms of the earth, spring bringing blossoms and harvests, winter bringing silence and scarcity. They experienced joy and sorrow, life and death, just as we do. Yet they did not explain these things with science or machines, but with stories, stories of gods, heroes, and spirits who shaped the very fabric of their lives. For the Greeks, myths were not childish tales. They were explanations, sacred lessons, and companions through the unknown. If the crops failed, it was not simply the weather, it was Demeter's grief. If the thunder roared, it was Zeus striking from the heavens. If the sea grew restless, it was Poseidon shaking his trident beneath the waves. Every force of nature was alive with personality. Every mystery carried meaning. And in this way, the Greeks felt less alone. They were part of a cosmos that breathed, a cosmos where even the darkest shadows held a story waiting to be told. The myth of Persephone and Hades sits at the heart of this tapestry. To the Greeks, it explains something essential: the cycle of the seasons. Why does the world burst into life each spring? Why does it wither in winter? Why must abundance always be followed by scarcity? The answer was not random chance. It was the movement of Persephone, the maiden who belonged to two worlds. When she rose to the earth, flowers bloomed and fields flourished. When she descended below, the earth grew barren, mourning her absence. In listening to this myth, we are hearing not only a story about gods, but a story about how the Greeks lived with the land. Their survival depended on harvests. Their joy depended on seasons of growth. And so, the myth was not distant or abstract. It was woven into their very survival, their very breath. Imagine an ancient farmer standing in a field, watching the first shoots of green break through the soil, whispering thanks to Demeter and to her daughter. Imagine that same farmer, months later, seeing the stalks wither under frost, knowing Persephone had gone back to the underworld. Myths were living companions, guiding people through the changes of the world around them. But Greek mythology was more than an explanation for natural cycles. It was also a mirror of the human soul. The Greeks saw in their gods the reflection of themselves, magnified and eternal. Zeus was not only the sky, he was authority, power, and judgment. Athena was not only wisdom, she was the careful planner, the strategist, the voice of reason. Aphrodite was not only beauty, she was desire, the pull that binds hearts and sometimes breaks them. And Hades was not only death, he was the stillness that waits for everyone, the certainty that balances the chaos of life. When we place Persephone and Hades into this context, their story becomes more than a tale of abduction and compromise. It becomes a meditation on the duality of existence. For Persephone, maiden of spring, could not remain in innocence forever. Like all things, she was destined to change, to pass from light into shadow, to grow into something new. For Hades, ruler of the underworld, his solitude could not last forever either. The two were bound, not by chance, but by the deep truth the Greeks saw everywhere, that life and death are not enemies, but partners in the eternal dance of being. Let us also remember that myths were not told in silence or in solitude. They were shared aloud, spoken by poets and storytellers, sung by bards, acted out in plays. Picture a gathering at dusk in an ancient Greek village. The fire crackles softly, shadows flicker against stone walls, and the storyteller leans forward, voice low and deliberate. Children lean closer, elders nod in recognition. The entire community held together by words that carried both memory and magic. To fall asleep to such stories would not have been unusual, for they were woven into every corner of life, teaching lessons even as they soothed. What is most enchanting is that these stories were not fixed. They shifted with the teller, with the time, with the place. Sometimes Persephone was a victim. Sometimes she was a queen who chose her path. Sometimes Hades was cruel. Sometimes he was simply lonely. Myths lived because they could be retold, reshaped, reimagined, just as dreams are never the same from one night to the next. As you listen tonight, you may feel yourself carried back into that ancient world, where the stars shone brighter without the glow of cities, where the sound of the sea carried farther, where the turning of the seasons was felt in every breath. The Greeks saw themselves not as separate from nature, but as part of it, and their myths reflected that belonging. The story of Persephone was not distant to them. It was as close as the earth beneath their feet, as close as the hunger in their stomachs, as close as the grief and hope in their hearts. So, as we prepare to follow Persephone into her meadow, and Hades into his underworld, remember that this is not just their story. It is humanity's story, the story of change, of cycles, of endings that become beginnings again. A story that has comforted those who feared the winter and delighted those who saw the first blossoms of spring. It is a story that belongs to all who have ever wondered at the mystery of life and death, and sought peace in knowing that even in darkness, there is meaning. Now, let us return to that quiet meadow, where the flowers bend in the evening breeze, and where Persephone, unaware of her fate, gathers blossoms under the fading sun. The myth awaits. To understand the weight of the story of Persephone and Hades, we must first turn our gaze to the two realms that shaped their lives, the brilliant heights of Olympus above and the shadowed stillness of the underworld below. They are opposites, yet together they form the backdrop of the myth, two sides of existence forever bound together, as light is bound to shadow. Imagine for a moment the lofty world of Olympus. The ancients believed that high above the earth, resting on a mountaintop shrouded in mist, stood the radiant home of the gods. The air there was always clear, the skies always bright. Golden palaces glittered against the heavens, their columns rising like eternal guardians of divine power. The gods who lived there were immortal, yet their lives reflected the passions and conflicts of mortals. They loved, they quarreled, they schemed, they laughed. From this glittering seat of eternity, they watched over the mortal world below, intervening when it suited them, withdrawing when it did not. Olympus was a place of grandeur, but also of restlessness. Zeus ruled with his thunderbolt, Athena counseled with wisdom, Apollo sang with music, and Aphrodite swayed hearts with beauty. To the Greeks, this was a vision of perfection, yet not without flaws, for the gods themselves mirrored the unpredictability of human nature. They embodied the brightness of life, the joys of the sun, the celebration of love, the triumphs of power. Now, let us contrast this radiant realm with another world, one far removed from the brilliance of Olympus. Beneath the earth, hidden from mortal eyes, lay the underworld. If Olympus was golden and shining, the underworld was hushed and dim. If Olympus was filled with voices and laughter, the underworld echoed with silence. This was the domain of Hades, where the souls of the dead journeyed after leaving the world of the living. The Greeks did not imagine the underworld as endless fire or torment. Instead, it was a land of stillness, divided into places of shadow and repose. Some souls wandered aimlessly in fields of asphodel, gentle flowers of pale gray-white. Others, the heroic or blessed, found themselves in the Elysian fields, a realm of eternal spring where soft breezes carried peace. And then there was Tartarus, deep and hidden, where punishment awaited only the gravest offenders. The underworld was not cruel to all. It was simply inevitable. It was balance. It was the destination that awaited every mortal heart. Hades himself was its ruler, and though later ages painted him with dread, the Greeks did not always see him as wicked. He was stern, yes, and unyielding, but he was also just. He did not torment the souls that entered his realm. He merely ensured that they remained there, that the boundary between life and death was never broken. In this way, he was not unlike his brother Zeus. Where Zeus ruled the skies and law, Hades ruled below with equal authority, maintaining the order of things. Think for a moment about this balance. Above, Olympus, bright, vibrant, filled with the energy of life. Below, the underworld, quiet, still, filled with the certainty of death. Between them, the mortal world, where fields grew and withered, where humans loved and grieved, where time passed swiftly. The myth of Persephone belongs to this meeting place, where brightness and shadow touched, where the joy of spring was forever linked with the silence of winter. For the Greeks, this contrast was not frightening but natural. They lived in a land of seasons, where the warmth of the sun was always followed by the chill of frost. They saw the cycle of day and night, life and death, as reflections of the same eternal truth. Nothing lasts forever, and in every ending there is a beginning. The gods themselves embodied this truth. Zeus the thunderstorm, Demeter the harvest, Hades the grave, Persephone the bloom of spring. Together, they told the story of existence. Now, imagine standing in that ancient world, looking upward at the star-filled night. Far above, Olympus gleams like a hidden light, unreachable, eternal. Beneath your feet, though you cannot see it, the underworld stretches into endless silence. And here you stand, a mortal in the middle, caught between two eternities, one of light and one of shadow. This is where the story unfolds. When Persephone walked the earth, she carried with her the brightness of Olympus, the innocence of youth, the joy of life in bloom. But when Hades reached for her, he pulled her into his world of shadow, into the hushed stillness that few could escape. Their union was not simply a romance or a crime. It was a binding of realms. Through them, Olympus above and the underworld below became forever connected, just as spring is forever tied to winter. The Greeks did not tell this story to frighten children, nor to cast judgment on gods. They told it to explain what they saw around them, to find meaning in the contrasts that shaped their lives. Brightness cannot exist without shadow, and shadow cannot exist without brightness. Olympus without the underworld would be incomplete, and life without death would be meaningless. In the stillness of the myth, there is comfort, for it reminds us that even in the deepest winter, spring will return. So, as we move forward into Persephone's tale, hold in your mind these two worlds, Olympus, radiant above, and the underworld, silent below. Hold them as two halves of a whole, as day and night, as breath and rest. For it is between these worlds, in the tension of their meeting, that Persephone's story takes root. And now, with the contrast set, we will turn our gaze more closely to Hades himself, the god of shadows, the misunderstood ruler of the silent realm, who would soon change the fate of Persephone and the earth itself. When people today hear the name Hades, they often picture a villain cloaked in shadow, a sinister figure lurking in the darkness, plotting the misery of others. Popular culture has painted him with fire, cruelty, and rage, as though he were a devil in disguise. Yet the truth, when we step back into the world of the ancient Greeks, is more complicated, more subtle, and in some ways, far gentler. Hades was not evil. He was not a demon who took delight in suffering. He was, instead, one of the great rulers of the cosmos, a god of balance, necessary and inevitable, as constant as the turning of the seasons. To understand the tale of Persephone, we must understand the man behind the shadows. Hades was the son of Cronus and Rhea, born into a generation of gods that lived before the Olympians reigned supreme. Cronus, fearful of being overthrown by his children, swallowed each child at birth, hiding them within his own body. Hades, like his siblings, was swallowed whole, trapped in darkness until Zeus, the youngest, rose up against their father. When Cronus was defeated, the children were freed, and the world was divided among them. Zeus took the skies, Poseidon took the seas, and Hades was given dominion over the underworld. Notice here that Hades did not choose his role, nor was it a punishment. It was simply the portion of the cosmos that fell to him, the eternal duty he was destined to fulfill. Unlike his brothers, who were constantly meddling in mortal affairs, Hades did not dwell above in palaces or stride across the seas. He kept to his realm, the unseen domain below the earth. His presence was quiet, his rule steady, and in that silence, Hades became a figure of mystery, misunderstood because of the nature of his charge. The Greeks feared death, as we all do. They mourned the passing of loved ones. They feared the unknown that came after the last breath, and they wondered what awaited them in the shadows. Because Hades was the guardian of that domain, his name itself became taboo. To speak it aloud was to invite attention from the realm of the dead. And so, Hades gained a reputation he did not quite deserve. His silence was mistaken for cruelty, his distance for malice, his inevitability for evil. Yet if we look more closely, a different picture begins to emerge. Hades was called by another name, Platon, meaning the giver of wealth. Why? Because from the earth came not only death, but life. Crops grew from the soil, precious metals and stones were mined from beneath the ground, and seeds hidden in darkness burst forth into blossoms. Hades was not only the keeper of souls, but the keeper of abundance, the silent provider who gave humanity the riches of the earth. In this sense, he was not only a ruler of endings, but also of beginnings. Unlike Zeus, who was known for his infidelities, or Poseidon, whose temper shook the seas, Hades was a god of restraint. He rarely left his realm. He did not chase after mortal women or parade himself before the world. His story is quieter, his actions fewer, yet his importance no less profound. He kept the order of existence, ensuring that the souls of the dead did not wander back among the living, ensuring that the boundaries between life and death were honored. In this, there is a kind of dignity, a steady sense of justice. Still, the myth of Persephone changed how many saw him. To take the maiden of spring from her mother was, to some, an act of violence, of cruelty. And yet, if we look at older tellings of the myth, the tone is not always one of villainy. In some versions, Hades does not trick Persephone, but instead offers her a place of honor as his queen. He does not treat her with brutality, but with respect, making her his equal in the underworld. In these tellings, Persephone does not remain a victim. She becomes a powerful ruler, seated beside Hades, shaping the fate of souls with her presence. This duality, Hades as abductor and Hades as husband, mirrors the duality of death itself. To the fearful, death feels like theft, like something cruel and sudden that takes away joy. To the contemplative, death is also a transition, a passage into another kind of existence, an inevitable step on the journey of all living things. Hades embodies this paradox, both feared and respected, both shadow and giver of hidden gifts. When you imagine him, do not picture a figure aflame with rage. Instead, picture a tall, solemn god, cloaked in darkness but not in anger. His eyes are steady, his face calm, his presence firm but not cruel. He does not seek to harm, but he does not yield. He holds the keys to the underworld, and with them, he guards the boundary that no mortal can cross twice. He is not laughter and lightning like Zeus, not storm and fury like Poseidon. He is stillness, silence, inevitability. He is the winter earth waiting beneath the snow, the seeds sleeping in darkness, the gatekeeper of eternity. It is important to remember, too, that the Greeks did not see their gods as wholly good or wholly evil. The gods were complex, like the humans who worshipped them, full of contradictions and subtleties. Hades could be feared and respected at once. He could represent loss and abundance at once. In him, they saw the inevitability of their own fate and the possibility of hidden treasures that lay beneath what seemed like endings. So when we hear the story of Hades and Persephone, let us not imagine a simple villain. Let us instead see a god who was lonely, bound to a role that separated him from the joy of the living. Let us see a ruler who desired companionship, who sought a queen to sit beside him, who, in bringing Persephone to his realm, forever bound the underworld to the cycle of the earth above. Let us see him as the Greeks once did, not as a demon, but as a keeper, a guardian, a figure who ensures that the great balance of existence endures. As the story unfolds, we will see Persephone's innocence drawn into his shadow. We will see her transformation from maiden to queen, from a girl of blossoms to a ruler of eternity. And in this transformation, Hades himself will be revealed not as a monster, but as a counterpart, as necessary as the silence that follows every song. Now, with a clearer picture of who Hades truly was, we can turn our gaze to Persephone herself, the radiant maiden of spring, daughter of Demeter, whose light was destined to enter his shadows. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and Zeus, king of the gods. But though she carried the blood of Olympian rulers, she was not raised in the thunder of Olympus or in the storms of power. She was raised among the meadows, where flowers blossomed and soft winds drifted through the grass. If Hades was stillness and shadow, Persephone was motion and light, a figure who embodied youth, beauty, and the endless renewal of spring. To the Greeks, she was more than a maiden. She was the very rhythm of life itself, the pulse of the earth awakening after winter's long sleep. Her name itself carried layers of meaning. Some traditions called her Kore, the maiden, a word that emphasized her youth, her innocence, her position at the threshold of womanhood. Others linked her name to ideas of bringing death or destruction, perhaps foreshadowing the dual role she would later play as queen of the underworld. In her earliest form, however, Persephone was remembered as a radiant girl, surrounded by companions, gathering flowers in the fields, beloved by her mother, watched over carefully so that no harm would come to her. Demeter cherished her daughter above all else. The bond between them was not just maternal, but elemental. For Demeter, Persephone was more than family. She was her heart, her joy, her very reason for tending the earth with such love. Wherever Persephone walked, blossoms followed. Meadows seemed greener, rivers seemed clearer, the world itself seemed to shine brighter. It was as if the earth bloomed in response to her presence. For Demeter, to lose her was unthinkable, and so she kept her close, nurturing her innocence, protecting her from the harsher realities of gods and men. But innocence cannot last forever. The world of myth often tells us that beauty, once noticed, cannot remain untouched. Persephone's beauty did not belong only to her mother. It caught the attention of others as well. Among them was Hades, who saw in her a light that might soften his realm of shadows. His gaze was not the only one, though Zeus, Apollo, Hermes, and even mortals were said to admire her radiance. Yet Persephone's story is not one of courtship filled with choice, but of destiny, shaped by forces larger than herself. In her youth, Persephone was often depicted in moments of delight, running through fields, her hands full of blossoms, her laughter mingling with the sound of bees and flowing streams. The Homeric hymn to Demeter tells us that it was while she was gathering flowers that her fate arrived. She reached for a bloom so rare, so captivating, that it drew her away from her companions. It was at that moment, as her fingers touched the petals, that the earth beneath her opened, and Hades emerged in his dark chariot. The Maiden of Spring was taken into the depths, her cries echoing into the sky, unheard by all except her mother. Yet before this fateful moment, before the abduction that myth remembers so vividly, we must pause to see her not only as a victim, but as a figure with a destiny greater than innocence. For Persephone was not meant to remain forever in the role of maiden. She was meant to transform, like the seed buried beneath the soil, hidden and unseen before bursting into bloom. Persephone carried within her the promise of duality. She would be both maiden and queen, light and shadow, joy and sorrow. The Greeks did not tell her story only to explain why flowers return after winter. They told it to remind themselves that life itself is a cycle of change. Childhood gives way to adulthood. Innocence gives way to experience. Joy is braided with grief, and every ending carries within it the seed of renewal. Persephone's journey was the mythic mirror of this truth. She began as Kore, the maiden, untouched by sorrow. But through her descent into the underworld, she became Persephone, queen of the dead, a ruler in her own right, with power equal to Hades himself. Her presence in the myth is gentle yet profound. Imagine her standing in a meadow, the sun falling across her hair, her arms full of blossoms. She does not know yet that the earth beneath her feet waits to claim her, that her cries will shake the heavens, that her mother will wander in grief searching for her. At this moment, she is the embodiment of all that is fleeting and beautiful, the reminder that joy can be fragile, and that even the brightest flower can be plucked too soon. And yet, to see Persephone only as fragile is to miss her true strength. For in the underworld, she will not remain powerless. In time, she will grow into her role, standing beside Hades not as a captive, but as an equal. She will learn to hold authority, to pass judgment on souls, to embody the balance between life and death. The transformation from maiden to queen is not one of destruction, but of evolution, of awakening to a greater destiny. The Greeks understood that no season lasts forever. Spring is always followed by summer, summer by autumn, autumn by winter. But winter is not the end, for spring always returns. Persephone embodied this truth, moving between worlds, reminding humanity that every loss is followed by renewal, every darkness followed by light. In her, they saw not only the grief of separation, but the comfort of return. This is why Persephone was so beloved, not only by Demeter but by those who told her story. She was hope itself, the assurance that winter would not last forever, that fields would bloom again, that the cycle of life was unbroken. And so, even in the darkest parts of her tale, even in the moment of abduction, there lingers the promise of her return, the certainty that she will rise again from the shadows to walk among the blossoms. As we prepare to follow Persephone into her fate, let us hold this image of her close, a maiden laughing in the meadows, hands full of blossoms, unaware of the shadow that waits beneath. She is innocence at the edge of transformation, the moment before the seed is planted, the breath before the silence. She is the promise that even in the darkest depths, spring will find a way to return. When Persephone was taken, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. In the meadows where her laughter once rang out, silence fell. The flowers she had gathered lay scattered upon the ground, their petals bruised and wilting, as though they mourned with her. The earth had swallowed her, and in her absence, the balance of nature began to shift. Yet no one felt the loss more deeply than her mother, Demeter, whose heart broke in a way that reverberated through the very soil she ruled. Demeter, goddess of harvest and fertility, had always been the tender caretaker of humanity. Through her blessing, grain ripened, fruits swelled with sweetness, and the earth offered abundance. But her devotion to humankind was nothing compared to her devotion to Persephone. That bond was more than a mother's love. It was a lifeline, a sacred connection that gave her purpose. When Persephone vanished, that purpose collapsed. The Homeric hymn to Demeter tells us that Demeter wandered the earth in grief, disguised as a mortal woman, her tears flowing like rivers. She called her daughter's name into the wind, searching in forests, fields, and along the shores of the sea. But no voice answered her. The sun rose and set, but to Demeter, time lost meaning. Days blurred together in an endless cycle of searching and sorrow. Every place she turned, she expected to find Persephone's trace, perhaps a footprint in the soil, a strand of golden hair caught in the breeze. But there was nothing, only silence. It was not long before her grief began to seep into the earth itself. Crops withered, seeds refused to sprout, trees bore no fruit. The world, once abundant under Demeter's care, began to starve. Famine spread across the land. Farmers prayed for rain, for sunlight, for the gentle touch of growth, but Demeter had withdrawn her blessing. The goddess of the harvest, consumed by grief, could no longer nurture the earth. For mortals, the famine was devastating. Families starved, fields lay barren, and temples once filled with offerings stood empty, for there was little left to give. Yet in their despair, mortals continued to call upon Demeter, begging her to restore life to the soil. But Demeter's heart was unmoved. She cared nothing for grain or fruit, for she had lost the bloom dearest to her. Persephone was gone, and without her, the world could wither away, and Demeter would not care. There is something haunting in this image of the goddess. She was not raging like Hera, nor striking with thunder like Zeus. She was grieving, and grief itself became a weapon, reshaping the world. Her sorrow was so great that it altered the cycle of life, turning abundance into barrenness, joy into suffering. Grief became famine, and famine became a force that threatened gods and mortals alike. At last, whispers began to reach Demeter. Hecate, goddess of crossroads and mysteries, told her that she had heard Persephone's cries, though she did not know where they had gone. Helios, the sun god who sees all from his chariot in the sky, revealed the truth. Persephone had been taken by Hades into the underworld, with Zeus's consent. At these words, Demeter's grief ignited into fury. Not only had her daughter been stolen, but the king of the gods himself had allowed it. Her rage was silent but absolute. She withdrew entirely from Olympus, refusing to take her place among the gods. She disguised herself further, wandering the mortal world, dwelling in shadows. It was during this wandering that she came to Eleusis, a small city in Greece, where she revealed herself to a noble family and nursed their infant child. She even attempted to make the child immortal, laying him in the fire each night to burn away his mortality. When the child's mother interrupted the ritual in terror, Demeter revealed her true form, radiant and terrible, and demanded that a great temple be built in her honor. This temple would later become the heart of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret cult devoted to Demeter and Persephone, promising initiates hope in life and comfort in death. Even in this, however, Demeter's heart remained heavy. No temple, no worship, no honor could replace the presence of her daughter. She sat in the temple she had demanded, veiled in shadow, refusing to eat or drink, refusing to let the earth grow. The world wasted away, and Zeus, at last, began to notice the consequence. Mortals were dying in such numbers that their offerings to the gods ceased. Without sacrifice, the gods themselves would be weakened. The harmony of the cosmos trembled on the edge of collapse, all because one goddess grieved. This is where the myth reveals its power. Demeter's sorrow is not only a mother's grief, but a cosmic truth. The earth cannot thrive without balance. Without Persephone, there is no spring, no renewal, no blossoming. Without the return of what is loved, the cycle breaks. Demeter embodied this truth, and her despair showed humanity what it meant to live in a world without hope of return. Zeus, realizing that the survival of gods and men alike depended on Demeter's healing, sent Hermes, the swift messenger, down into the underworld to speak with Hades. He commanded that Persephone be returned to her mother so that life might flourish again. But by then, a fateful act had already been committed. Hades, knowing he could not hold Persephone forever against her will, had offered her a pomegranate seed, a token both beautiful and binding. By eating it, Persephone had tied herself to the underworld, ensuring that part of her would always belong to him. Demeter did not yet know this. She only knew that her daughter might come back, and in that small hope, she began to stir. Imagine her sitting in the temple at Eleusis, her face pale with sorrow, her hands empty of grain. Then she hears Hermes approach, carrying news that Persephone may return. For the first time since her daughter vanished, her heart beats with anticipation. The famine pauses, the earth holds still, waiting to see if the cycle will be restored. Demeter's love is not passive. It is fierce, unyielding, and powerful enough to bend the will of gods. Her despair, though devastating, is also the force that compels resolution. Without her grief, there would be no demand for balance, no explanation for the seasons, no reminder that even gods are bound by love. As this part of the tale closes, we see Demeter not as a distant deity, but as a mother whose love shakes the world. She has lost her daughter, and in her sorrow, she has made the earth barren. Yet her love also carries the promise of renewal, the hope that Persephone may return, bringing life back to the soil, warmth back to the air, joy back to the world. And so, the earth waits with her. The fields remain empty, the trees stand bare, the rivers slow in grief. All of nature bends to Demeter's despair, holding its breath for the return of spring. The abduction of Persephone is one of those moments in mythology that lingers in the imagination because it is both sudden and inevitable, like the turning of a season. It begins not with thunder or war, but with a quiet scene in a sunlit meadow. Persephone is among her companions, daughters of the sea god Nereus, wandering across the fields, their hands filled with blossoms. They laugh and play, bending to gather violets, crocuses, and irises. The Homeric hymn tells us that the air was heavy with fragrance, and the earth itself seemed to yield flowers in abundance, as if to entice her further away from the others. Among the blossoms, there appeared a bloom unlike any other, the narcissus, radiant with a beauty that shimmered with divine allure. It did not grow by chance. It was placed there by Gaia, at Zeus's bidding, to serve as the lure that would bring Persephone to the edge of destiny. Drawn to its brilliance, Persephone bent down to pluck it, her fingers reaching for its luminous petals. And then, In that fragile moment of innocence, the world itself split apart. The ground rumbled, splitting open with a sound that shook the meadow. From the chasm below rose Hades, lord of the underworld, in his black chariot drawn by immortal horses. The sunlight seemed to dim as he emerged, his form dark and commanding, his eyes fixed upon Persephone. Before she could cry out, he seized her, lifting her into his chariot, and the earth closed again above them, sealing the wound, leaving behind only silence and the scattered flowers. The other maidens looked around in confusion, searching for their companion. They had heard her scream, but when they turned, she was gone, vanished without trace. Only the flowers she had dropped remained, fragile evidence of the violence that had torn her from their midst. The meadow fell silent, as though the earth itself was complicit in the act, holding its secrets close. Persephone's cry, however, did not vanish into silence. It rose to the heavens, a desperate call for help. She called upon her mother, upon Zeus, upon the gods above. But her cries went unanswered. Only Hecate, dwelling in her shadowed realms, heard faintly the echoes of her voice, and Helios, riding his golden chariot across the sky, bore witness to the scene. For all others, the moment passed unseen, as if the abduction had been hidden from the world by divine design. This image, the maiden taken by force into the depths of the earth, has haunted storytellers for centuries. It is the crossing of a threshold, the moment where innocence is lost and transformation begins. For Persephone, it was terror, the sudden ripping away from light and air, the plunge into darkness. For Hades, it was possession, the claiming of the one he desired, sanctioned by Zeus himself. For Demeter, it was the beginning of grief that would shake the very balance of nature. The myth does not shy away from the violence of the act. Hades does not ask permission. He does not woo or court. He takes. This act of abduction reflects not only the power dynamics of the gods, but also the ancient Greek view of marriage itself, often arranged and binding, often involving the daughter being taken from her mother's household into her husband's domain. In Persephone's abduction, myth and social reality intertwined, weaving a story that spoke both of cosmic forces and human experience. Yet within the terror, there is also symbolism. The opening of the earth is more than a physical chasm. It is the gateway between life and death, between innocence and maturity. Just as a seed must be buried in soil before it can grow, Persephone's descent into the underworld marks the planting of her destiny. The abduction is violent, but it is also transformative. Without it, she would remain forever Kore, the maiden. Through it, she becomes Persephone, queen of shadows, bearer of the cycle of life and death. Imagine, for a moment, the chariot thundering downward into the gloom, Persephone's hair streaming behind her, her voice echoing in the caverns. Around her, the air grows colder, the light dimmer. The horses, immortal and black as night, charge into the depths, their hooves striking sparks against stone. Hades holds the reins, his gaze fixed forward, his grip unyielding. Persephone, trembling, clings to the edge of the chariot, torn between fear and defiance. Behind them, the crack in the earth seals shut, leaving no sign of what has transpired. To the world above, it seems as if nothing has happened. The meadow lies still, the sun continues to shine, the maidens wander in confusion. Yet beneath the surface, a new chapter has begun. Persephone has crossed the boundary no mortal or immortal may cross lightly. She has descended into the kingdom of the dead, into the arms of the god who rules them. The abduction is not the end of her story, but the hinge upon which everything turns. Without it, there would be no grief of Demeter, no famine, no bargain, no seasons. The Greeks understood this moment as both tragedy and necessity, as both loss and renewal. It is the rupture that allows for the cycle of death and rebirth to be explained, the reason why the earth lies barren in winter and blooms again in spring. When we tell this story in the stillness of night, when we imagine Persephone's cry echoing into the air, we touch upon something universal, the feeling of being pulled into darkness, of losing the light we once knew. And yet, in that darkness, a transformation waits. For Persephone, the descent is not only an ending but the beginning of her becoming. The meadow remains, flowers scattered like fragments of memory. The maidens search, calling her name into the wind. Somewhere above, Helios sees all, and Hecate listens in silence. Somewhere below, Persephone rides deeper into shadow, unaware that her mother will soon begin a journey of her own, a journey of grief and defiance that will shake gods and mortals alike. The earth has closed, but the story has only just begun. The chariot thundered downward, carrying Persephone from the sunlit fields into the deep unknown. The moment the earth closed above her, the familiar world of light and laughter was gone. In its place came a silence heavy with shadows, broken only by the pounding hooves of Hades' immortal steeds. The descent into the underworld was unlike any path a mortal could imagine. It was not a simple tunnel, but a passage between worlds, where the boundaries of life and death blurred. The Greeks pictured this journey as both physical and symbolic. The underworld lay beneath the earth, but it was also a state of being, a realm set apart from all others. As Persephone was carried into its depths, she was not merely traveling through stone and cavern. She was crossing into a different reality, one that would forever mark her. At first, she resisted. The hymn to Demeter tells us her cries rang out still, her voice sharp with fear, calling for her mother, for Zeus, for anyone who could hear. But her voice was swallowed by the distance. Each moment carried her farther from the world that had always nurtured her. The sunlight faded, then dimmed, then vanished entirely, until only the flickering glow of unseen fires lit the path. The chariot raced on, guided by Hades' sure hand, deeper and deeper into shadow. The air grew colder, and Persephone clutched her robes around her, shivering. The flowers she had gathered were gone, scattered in the meadow above, their colors left behind like fragments of a dream. She had entered a place where no flower bloomed, where no breeze carried the scent of spring. It was a realm of stillness, where the silence seemed alive, watching, waiting. Yet even in this darkness, Persephone was not alone. The underworld was not barren. Shades of the dead drifted along the path, silent figures moving in endless procession. They did not speak, but their presence filled the air with a quiet weight, as if Persephone had entered into their eternal vigil. Some were kings who once ruled proudly. Others were simple farmers, children, or soldiers who had fallen in war. All were equal here, reduced to shadow and memory. To see them was to glimpse a truth that mortals rarely faced, that death comes for all, and in its kingdom, all are the same. For Persephone, the sight must have been terrifying, yet also profound. She was the daughter of gods, raised in the radiance of Olympus and the blossoms of the earth. Now she was carried through the realm of endings, where even immortals had little power. She saw what awaited mortals after life, and though she was still trembling with fear, part of her began to understand the depth of her new role. The descent has often been read as a metaphor for transformation. Just as seeds are buried beneath soil before they can sprout, Persephone was buried in shadow before she could bloom into her full self. The maiden, Kore, was being carried into the darkness where she would become Persephone, a figure of duality, queen of the underworld, yet still the promise of spring. In this way, her abduction was not only an act of violence, but also the beginning of an evolution. The chariot moved past rivers that marked the boundaries of the underworld. Persephone glimpsed the Styx, its black waters shimmering faintly, binding even the gods with oaths unbreakable. She saw the Acheron, the river of sorrow, its current heavy with the grief of countless souls. Somewhere deeper flowed the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and the Phlegethon, burning with fire. These were no ordinary rivers. They were cosmic forces, shaping the destiny of every soul who entered. And Persephone, still clinging to the edge of the chariot, was being pulled into their realm. Through caverns vast and echoing, through mists that curled like breath, she descended until at last the great gates of the underworld rose before her. Towering and grim, they were guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed hound whose growls echoed like thunder. His eyes burned with fire, yet at the command of Hades, he stood aside, allowing master and captive to pass within. For Persephone, crossing those gates was the final step. She had left the realm of life behind. Ahead lay the halls of the dead, the kingdom of her captor, and the destiny she had never chosen. Her cries faded into silence, her struggle stilled. The descent was complete. She was in the underworld. And yet, even here, something remained of her light. The myths tell us that her presence in the underworld would forever change it. Where once there was only shadow, there would now be balance. Where once death was final, there would now be the promise of return. Persephone's very being carried within it the cycle of renewal, and even as she stood trembling in the halls of Hades, that promise remained. The descent into darkness is one of the most enduring archetypes in storytelling. We see it in myths across cultures, the hero or heroine who journeys into the underworld, into night, into the unknown, and emerges transformed. For Persephone, the descent was forced upon her, yet the transformation was no less real. She would not remain forever the frightened maiden in the chariot. She would grow into a queen whose name carried weight in both life and death. As she stepped across the threshold, the air of the underworld wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. The shadows whispered, the rivers sighed, the shades drifted in endless quiet. The world of sunlight was far above, unreachable. Here, time moved differently. Here, she would begin a new chapter, one that would ripple outward to mortals and gods alike. Above, Demeter searched, her grief spreading famine across the earth. Above, the fields lay barren, waiting for spring that would not come. Below, Persephone took her first steps into darkness, into a role that would forever bind her to the cycles of life and death. The descent was terrifying, but it was also sacred. It was the journey every seed takes, every soul, every season. To go down is not always to be lost. Sometimes, to descend is to prepare for return. And so, even in her fear, even in the silence, Persephone carried within her the promise that spring would rise again. The gates closed behind her, and Persephone found herself standing in the vast and mysterious kingdom of Hades. This was no meadow of flowers, no Olympian palace filled with laughter and light. Here, the very air seemed different, thick, cool, and heavy with silence, as though the world itself had paused. The underworld stretched before her, endless and strange, a landscape unlike anything she had ever known. The Greeks imagined the underworld not as a single place, but as a vast domain with many regions, each with its own character, its own destiny for the souls who dwelled there. At its heart stood the halls of Hades, somber and powerful, but all around stretched plains, rivers, and caverns where the dead found their eternal rest. For Persephone, who had spent her life among blooming fields, every sight must have seemed foreign, yet also filled with a certain awe. The first thing she would have noticed was the rivers. The underworld was defined by them, their waters flowing like veins through the body of death itself. The Styx, dark and unyielding, wound its way across the land. This was no ordinary river, but the boundary of sacred oaths. Even the gods feared to swear falsely upon it, for its power was absolute. Beside it ran the Acheron, the river of sorrow, where newly dead souls were ferried by Charon across its mournful currents. Persephone might have glimpsed him, the old boatman with hollow eyes, steering his skiff through the mist, demanding his coin from each shade before allowing passage. Deeper still flowed the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Those who drank from its waters would lose their memories, their lives erased, their past selves dissolved into shadow. For mortals who sought peace in oblivion, it was a gift, for others, a curse. There was also the Phlegethon, its fiery current blazing through the darkness, a reminder that even in death, the fury of passion and punishment endured. And finally, the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, echoing endlessly with cries of grief. These rivers together formed the lifeblood of the underworld, and Persephone's first steps were taken among their solemn whispers. The land itself was gray and dim, neither fully dark nor fully lit. Shadows clung to everything, and yet faint glimmers of fire and starlight flickered here and there, enough to guide the way. Shades moved quietly across vast plains, countless souls who had once walked the earth now reduced to hushed figures. They did not speak, though Persephone felt their presence all around her. Each one had a story, a life once lived, but here they drifted in silence, bound by the laws of Hades' realm. Among these regions were places of judgment. Persephone may have seen the gates leading to the plane where souls awaited their fate, watched over by judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who weighed each life and determined where the soul would rest. Some were sent to the asphodel meadows, a place of neutrality where the vast majority wandered without joy or sorrow. Others, who had lived with great honor, were granted passage to the Elysian fields, where soft breezes blew and golden light glowed eternal. Here, heroes and poets enjoyed peace, forever remembered and celebrated. And beyond, even Elysium, in some tales, lay the Isles of the Blessed, where the greatest of souls dwelled in eternal paradise. But for those who had lived wickedly, there was Tartarus, a realm of torment deeper than all others, where the enemies of the gods were cast down and punished without end. There, giants who had warred against Olympus were bound in chains, and great sinners endured their eternal sentences. Sisyphus rolled his stone endlessly uphill, only to watch it tumble back. Tantalus reached for food and water that receded forever from his grasp. Ixion spun upon his fiery wheel. These figures of myth were warnings as much as they were prisoners, reminders to mortals of the price of arrogance. For Persephone, glimpsing such punishments must have been chilling, yet it also revealed the scope of her new domain. At the center of this vast realm stood the palace of Hades himself. Unlike the shining halls of Olympus, it was not adorned with gold or jewels. Its beauty was stern, solemn, and austere, built of onyx and shadow, its pillars rising like dark trees in a forest of night. Within its walls burned torches that gave off a pale, ghostly light, illuminating the throne room where Hades ruled. It was here that Persephone was brought, her cries silenced, her fate sealed. The god of the underworld was not a monster, though the myths often paint him as stern and unyielding. He was the keeper of balance, the guardian of the dead, the one who ensured that souls remained where they belonged. To mortals, he seemed terrifying, for he represented the end they could not escape. Yet his realm was not chaos, but order, a place where every soul had its place. For Persephone, standing in his halls, the gravity of this truth must have weighed heavily. She was no longer only the daughter of Demeter. She was now bound to the ruler of death itself. And yet, something in her presence began to change the underworld. Where Persephone walked, there lingered a faint trace of spring, as though the memory of flowers still clung to her. Even in the deepest shadows, her arrival brought a subtle shift, a whisper of balance. For though she had been taken unwillingly, the myths suggest that her role was not merely that of a captive. She would become queen, standing beside Hades, sharing in the governance of this vast and solemn realm. The realm of Hades was not only a prison. It was a mirror of life, showing that every beginning has an ending, and every ending carries within it the seed of renewal. For Persephone, the halls of shadow would become as familiar as the meadows of her youth. She would walk among the shades, hear their silent stories, and learn to rule a kingdom where sorrow and peace mingled side by side. And above, in the world of light, the absence of her presence was already reshaping the earth. Crops failed, leaves withered, animals grew thin, and mortals prayed desperately for relief. Demeter searched without rest, her grief spreading famine across all lands. The balance of the cosmos was tipping, and all depended on the one who now stood quietly within the halls of the dead. Persephone had crossed into the realm of Hades, and nothing would ever be the same. In the quiet halls of the underworld, Persephone's heart beat like a bird caught in a cage. She stood before the throne of Hades, the ruler of this realm of silence and shadow, and though his presence was not violent, it carried a weight unlike any she had ever known. He sat upon his throne, solemn and still, his face unreadable, his eyes like obsidian, dark, steady, and unwavering. For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Hades was not like the other gods of Olympus. He did not radiate the brilliance of Apollo, nor the thunderous command of Zeus, nor even the playful charm of Hermes. His strength was quieter, deeper, more enduring, like the roots of an ancient mountain that could not be shaken by wind or time. To Persephone, raised among laughter and flowers, his presence must have felt overwhelming, yet also strangely composed. He did not rage. He did not mock. He simply was, the immovable force of death itself. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence stretched, and Persephone, frightened though she was, could not help but lift her gaze to meet his. What she saw there was not cruelty, but something more complicated, loneliness, perhaps, or the stern dignity of one who carries a burden no other will bear. It was then she may have realized that Hades, though her captor, was not a being of malice. He had not stolen her for sport or vengeance, but out of a yearning he himself could scarcely put into words. When at last he spoke, his voice was low, resonant, carrying through the chamber like the deep rumble of earth beneath the ground. He addressed her not as a prisoner, but as one meant to stand beside him. In his words, there was both finality and a kind of reverence, as though he recognized her importance even as he held her against her will. Persephone's reply, however, was shaped by fear. She thought of her mother, of the fields left behind, of the freedom that had been taken from her. Her words trembled as she demanded release, her voice carrying both the innocence of a maiden and the fire of a goddess. She was no ordinary mortal girl. She was the daughter of Demeter, and even in fear, she carried dignity. Hades listened, but he did not relent. It is said in some versions of the myth that in these early days Persephone wept, her cries echoing through the halls of the underworld. The shades of the dead, who were accustomed to silence, turned their hollow eyes toward her, moved by the rare sound of life among them. Even Cerberus, the three-headed guardian, tilted his massive heads as though listening to her sorrow. Yet Hades remained still. He did not comfort her, but neither did he mock her tears. He watched, a figure of patience, waiting for the storm of her grief to subside. The underworld itself seemed to respond to her presence. Flowers that had never bloomed in shadow stirred faintly at her touch, as if the memory of sunlight still clung to her hands. Though she felt trapped, the land began to change, softening in subtle ways that she herself may not have noticed. This was the paradox of their first encounters. She was both captive and queen-to-be, frightened child and goddess whose presence altered the balance of death itself. Days may have passed in this uneasy rhythm, Hades silent and steady, Persephone restless and yearning for escape. She wandered the vast halls, guided reluctantly by attendants who bowed to her as if she were already sovereign. She resisted, refusing to eat, refusing to smile, but everywhere she turned, the underworld reminded her of its permanence. Its rivers flowed without end, its shadows lingered without change, and its ruler watched her with the patience of stone. Yet beneath that patience, there was something else, an offering of respect. Unlike Zeus, who took what he desired without thought of consequence, Hades seemed almost hesitant in his own stern way. He had claimed Persephone, yes, but he did not strike her or force her affection. He seemed instead to wait, as though time itself might soften her resistance. Perhaps he believed that in the silence of the underworld, in its order and solemn beauty, she might one day see more than her captivity. It is in this contrast that the myth begins to reveal its complexity. To mortals, the story of Persephone's abduction is one of violation and loss. To the gods, it was also a story of balance, of roles that must be fulfilled for the world to remain whole. In the earliest days of her time with Hades, Persephone could not see this balance. She saw only darkness, loss, and the aching absence of her mother. But Hades, in his calm endurance, already saw her as the other half of a realm that could not be governed by one alone. One can imagine her standing at the edge of the Lethe, gazing into its still waters, wondering what it would be to forget all that had come before. One can imagine her wandering the asphodel meadows, where countless souls drifted, their lives forgotten, but their presence eternal. Each sight deepened her understanding of the place she had been brought to, though her heart longed still for the world above. And always, Hades lingered nearby, not forcing himself upon her, but never far, like the shadow that accompanies every step. His words were few, but when he spoke, they carried weight. He told her of his duty, of the necessity of his realm, of the respect even the Olympians bore him despite their fear. Perhaps he even confessed, in his restrained way, that in her he saw not merely beauty but balance, a light that could temper the shadows he had carried alone. Their first encounters were marked by distance and silence, yet beneath both lay the slow beginnings of a bond. Not of love, not yet, but of recognition. Hades recognized in Persephone a strength she had not yet discovered in herself. Persephone, though unwilling, began to glimpse the solemn order of the underworld, a world that, for all its darkness, was not without dignity. It was in these early moments, heavy with tension and silence, that the seeds of their strange relationship were sown. Persephone remained a daughter yearning for her mother, a maiden mourning her lost freedom. But she was also beginning the slow transformation into something more, the queen of the dead, whose presence would forever alter both the underworld and the world above. Far above the shadowed halls of Hades, the world still turned, but it no longer flourished. The fields where Persephone once danced grew strangely quiet, as if the earth itself had noticed her absence. Crops that had once bent heavy with grain began to wither. Leaves browned and fell before their time, and flowers closed their petals, refusing to bloom. The seasons, once gentle in their rhythm, staggered beneath the sudden weight of sorrow. For Demeter, goddess of harvest and fertility, was consumed by grief, and her sorrow seeped into the very soil. Demeter had scoured the earth in desperation, calling out her daughter's name across valleys and mountains. She roamed in disguise, searching among mortals, questioning nymphs, even demanding answers from the river gods. Yet no one could tell her where Persephone had gone. The only witness, the nymph Cyane, had tried to stop Hades as he carried Persephone below, but the earth itself had swallowed them too quickly. In anguish, Cyane dissolved into a pool of tears, her voice lost in the waters, leaving Demeter with only silence. The goddess's heart grew heavy with despair. She wandered the world in mourning, refusing to return to Olympus, refusing even to tend the earth. Where her footsteps fell, the ground turned barren. The green fields faded into gray, and mortals who relied on the harvest began to suffer. Cattle grew thin, their ribs pressing through their skin. Farmers sowed seed, but nothing sprouted. Hungry children cried to mothers who had no bread to give. Slowly, famine spread across the land, not as a passing misfortune, but as an unrelenting shadow that deepened with each passing day. The gods watched from Olympus, their feasts interrupted by the prayers of mortals. Temples once filled with offerings now stood empty, for how could men spare grain or wine when their families starved? The smoke of sacrifice thinned until it vanished, and the bond between gods and mortals began to fray. Even Zeus, accustomed to receiving the reverence of humankind, felt the weight of this famine. For if mortals perished, who would remain to honor the gods? Who would build their temples, sing their hymns, and keep their names alive? But Demeter would not relent. She sat upon the earth, veiled in mourning, her eyes dim, her voice broken with sorrow. Some tales tell of her disguising herself as an old woman, wandering into the town of Eleusis. There, weary from her endless search, she sat by the well of the city, her face hidden, her heart still heavy. The daughters of King Celeus approached her, kind and curious, offering comfort to the stranger. They brought her to their home, where the queen, Metanera, welcomed her. In this house, Demeter found a moment of rest. She was offered food and drink, though she refused the wine and asked only for barley water, a humble drink of mortals. In gratitude, she resolved to bless the household. She grew fond of Metanera's infant son, Demophon, and secretly sought to grant him immortality by an ancient rite. Each night, she anointed the child with ambrosia and placed him in the fire to burn away his mortality. But when the queen discovered this strange ritual, she cried out in terror, breaking the spell. Demeter revealed herself in her true form, radiant and terrible, and commanded the people of Eleusis to build her a great temple. There she withdrew, cloaked in grief, letting the famine spread across the earth. This story, woven into the myth, became the seed of the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rites of Demeter and Persephone that promised initiates hope beyond death. Yet at its heart was still a tale of sorrow, a mother who would not let go, a goddess who abandoned her duties until her daughter was restored. The famine deepened. The rivers shrank, the trees stood bare, and the fields lay cracked and lifeless. Mortals cried out not only to Demeter, but to all the gods, begging for relief. They lit their last torches in temples, offering what little they had left, hoping the Olympians would hear. And at last, their cries reached Zeus. The king of the gods, seated upon his throne, could no longer ignore the suffering below. He saw the earth dying, the smoke of sacrifice dwindling, the order of the cosmos unraveling. He knew that if Demeter's grief continued, humankind itself might perish. And with their extinction, the gods would lose their worshippers, their honors, their very place in the mortal world. Balance had to be restored. But Zeus also knew the truth. It was his own brother who had taken Persephone. Hades, ruler of the dead, did not often meddle in the affairs of Olympus. But this act had bound the realms of life and death together in a way that could not easily be undone. If Persephone were returned, would Hades release her willingly? And if she remained below, would Demeter ever again allow the earth to flourish? The weight of this dilemma pressed upon him, and so he turned to Hermes, the messenger of the gods, swift and clever. With winged sandals at his feet, Hermes was commanded to descend into the underworld and deliver Zeus's decree. Persephone must be restored to her mother, or the world above would wither beyond repair. And so, while Demeter wept in her temple and mortals starved in their villages, Hermes began his journey downward, toward the shadowed realm where Persephone now dwelled. His descent marked the turning point in the tale, for it carried with it the first hope of reunion, though the terms of such a reunion remained uncertain. Above, the earth held its breath. The fields longed for rain, the soil longed for seed, and the people longed for bread. Demeter's grief was a grief shared by all, spreading across mountains and valleys, binding gods and mortals alike in a single, desperate hope that Persephone might return, and with her, the life of the earth. The command of Zeus carried Hermes swiftly into action. With his golden sandals laced tightly, their wings stirring the air with each step, he prepared for the journey few dared to make. The underworld was not unknown to him. Hermes, after all, was Psychopomp, the guide of souls, who often led the dead across the boundary between worlds. Yet each descent was its own kind of solemn pilgrimage, for to enter the kingdom of Hades was to leave behind the warmth of the living. He set out from Olympus, descending from the gleaming halls of the gods into the mortal world. The earth stretched beneath him, quiet and barren, the evidence of Demeter's grief plain to see. Fields lay cracked and empty, rivers thinned to a trickle, and the cries of hungry children echoed faintly in the wind. Hermes saw all this and knew the urgency of his mission. If Persephone were not restored, the suffering above would only deepen, and mortals might soon fade from the earth entirely. The path downward began with shadow. He followed the fissures of the earth, the hidden entrances known only to gods, where caverns opened like mouths into the depths. The air grew cooler as he descended, each step carrying him farther from the sunlight. Soon, the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves faded into silence, replaced by the distant sound of water, the murmur of the underworld's rivers calling him forward. At last, Hermes reached the threshold marked by the river Styx, its black waters winding endlessly through the gloom. The Styx was no ordinary river but a boundary of power. Even the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths upon its currents. Here, Hermes paused, the weight of its presence reminding him that he crossed into a realm ruled not by his father, nor his uncles of the sea or sky, but by the quiet authority of Hades. Waiting at the riverbank was Charon, the boatman, his figure gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hands gripping the worn pole of his skiff. To mortals, Charon demanded a coin for passage, but to Hermes, no toll was asked. The ferryman knew him well, for Hermes had guided countless shades to these shores. With a silent nod, Charon allowed him aboard, and together they drifted across the Styx. The waters rippled without sound, dark as oil, carrying them toward the deeper gates of the underworld. On either bank, Hermes glimpsed the shades of the newly dead, waiting in silence for their turn to cross. They reached out, not with hands, but with longing, their hollow eyes turning toward the messenger god, as if begging him for remembrance. Hermes, though quick and clever, felt the weight of their presence, for here he was not the trickster or herald, but the solemn guide of souls. Beyond the Styx, the land of shadow unfolded. He passed the meadows of Asphodel, where countless shades wandered aimlessly, their voices faint murmurs lost in the air. They turned as he passed, sensing his divine presence, but none dared approach. His pace was swift, for his task was clear, yet he could not help but take in the gravity of this place, the stillness, the silence, the timeless weight of eternity. Soon he came to the great gates, where Cerberus, the three-headed hound, stood guard. Each head snarled low, eyes glimmering with fire. But when they caught sight of Hermes, their growls softened. They knew him, as they knew all who walked between life and death. With a gesture, Hermes calmed the beast, his voice gentle, his hand raised in the familiar greeting of a god who had long walked these paths. Cerberus stepped aside, allowing him entry. Within the gates lay the palace of Hades, its dark pillars rising like a forest of shadow, its torches burning with pale light. The air was cool and heavy, and silence reigned, broken only by the faint rustle of spirits moving through the halls. Hermes walked steadily, his winged sandals gliding softly across the stone. Here, even his quick wit and playful charm were hushed, for he was in the domain of a god whose presence demanded respect. At last, he entered the throne room. There, upon his dark seat, sat Hades, solemn as stone, his gaze steady, his posture regal. Beside him stood Persephone, her face pale yet calm, her presence both maiden and queen. Her eyes, deep with longing, turned quickly when she saw Hermes, for in him she glimpsed a thread of hope, a connection to the world above that she feared had forgotten her. Hermes bowed before Hades, his voice smooth yet measured as he delivered the decree of Zeus. The world above was dying. Mortals starved, crops failed, and Demeter's grief grew unbearable. Zeus commanded that Persephone be restored to her mother, for without her return, the earth itself might not survive. Hermes spoke not as a trickster or mediator, but as herald of necessity, the will of Olympus carried in every word. The hall fell silent after his declaration. Persephone's heart must have leapt at the sound, yet she dared not speak. Hades, unmoved in expression, regarded Hermes steadily. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence as heavy as the walls around them. But in that silence lay the weight of choice, not only his, but of fate itself. In some versions of the tale, Hades answered not with anger, but with a solemn acknowledgement of necessity. He had taken Persephone, yes, but he knew the balance of the cosmos could not be ignored. To keep her holy might unravel more than his realm could bear. Yet he was not willing to let her go entirely. There was, perhaps, a compromise to be made, one sealed not by Zeus, nor Demeter, nor Hermes, but by Persephone herself. Hermes, standing between them, felt the tension of these silent exchanges. He knew his task was not yet complete, for delivering Zeus's command was only the beginning. The true resolution would rest upon the choices made in the moments that followed. As he stood there, the air of the underworld seemed to thicken, as if the realm itself awaited the decision. The shades paused, the rivers murmured more softly, even Cerberus at the gates grew still. All of existence seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Persephone would return to the world of sunlight, or remain forever bound to shadow. The tale of Persephone's descent into the underworld is not merely a story of abduction or a tale of a daughter taken from her mother. It is also a story of change, of metamorphosis, of a maiden who crosses the threshold into another identity. In the soft shadows of the underworld, Persephone gradually transforms into something more than the frightened daughter who had once cried out to the heavens as Hades carried her away. She becomes a queen, a figure of quiet power, balancing the delicate line between life and death, spring and winter, the mortal realm and the eternal world below. When Persephone first arrived in the underworld, her fear and sorrow were overwhelming. Ancient poets and storytellers describe her lamentations echoing through the halls of Hades, her longing for the open fields of the earth, for the warmth of the sun, and for her mother's embrace. But as time passed, the Maiden of Flowers began to adapt to her surroundings. She discovered that even in the realm of shadows, there were roles to be played, duties to uphold, and a strange form of dignity to claim. Slowly, the image of the weeping daughter began to fade, and in its place arose the silhouette of a regal figure, cloaked in authority. The underworld was not a place of complete silence or despair. It was, rather, a vast and intricate kingdom where countless souls dwelled, each awaiting judgment, release, or eternal rest. Persephone learned that her presence there was more than ornamental. She was not simply a wife to Hades. She was to become a ruler alongside him. In many myths, she is depicted sitting upon a throne beside her husband, lending a sense of fairness and compassion to a realm that might otherwise seem only cold and merciless. The presence of a queen softened the shadows, reminding the souls who entered that even in death, there was balance, and that the cycles of existence were overseen not only by stern authority, but also by gentleness. One of the most profound symbols of Persephone's transformation is the pomegranate. In the quiet corners of the underworld, she consumed its ruby-red seeds, a small act that forever bound her to that realm. The fruit of the pomegranate has long carried dual meanings, its abundance of seeds suggesting fertility, life, and renewal, but its blood-red color evoking death and permanence. By eating from it, Persephone accepted a paradox. She would forever belong to two worlds, one of life and one of death. This act was not simply a trick played upon her by Hades. It was also, in a way, her choice to embrace her destiny, to step into the role of a queen who straddles boundaries. The transformation of Persephone also reshaped how mortals thought of the underworld. Before her, the realm of Hades was often imagined as a dark, distant, and foreboding place. With her arrival, however, the underworld acquired a new tone. It was no longer only the land of shadows and sorrow. It became the realm overseen by a maiden who had once been the symbol of life's renewal. Persephone brought with her the lingering memory of springtime, and her presence suggested that even in the silence of the grave, there remained the whisper of rebirth, the possibility of return. This dual role of Persephone is what makes her so enduring in mythology. She is both the innocent maiden of blossoms and the solemn queen of shadows. She embodies youth and maturity, vulnerability and strength, life and death. For storytellers, this transformation gave her a complexity that few figures in mythology possess. She was not simply the victim of abduction, nor merely a passive figure in the narrative. She became an active participant, a ruler who influenced the fates of souls and stood as a counterpart to Hades. As queen, Persephone also gained the respect of the gods. Even the great Zeus, her father, acknowledged her place within the underworld, and mortals prayed to her as much as they feared her. In some ancient rites, Persephone was invoked during initiations into the mysteries, especially in the Eleusinian mysteries, where her role as the goddess who travels between life and death made her a powerful guide for those seeking spiritual rebirth. Her transformation into queen was not only a change of title, but also an expansion of her influence. Imagine the halls of the underworld, vast chambers lined with stone, rivers of shadow flowing through them, and the endless murmur of souls. There, Persephone would walk beside Hades, not as a captive, but as his equal. The imagery is striking. A goddess who had once been associated with flowers and sunlight, now holding dominion over silence and eternity. Yet in her presence, the underworld was no longer absolute darkness. She carried with her a light from the world above, a reminder that cycles continue, that endings always give way to beginnings. And so, Persephone's transformation is not one of loss alone. It is not merely the sad story of a maiden taken from her mother. It is also the story of growth, of finding identity within unexpected circumstances, and of embodying two worlds at once. Through her, the Greeks explained not only the turning of the seasons, but also the very nature of existence, the way life and death are woven together, inseparable yet distinct. In her silence and her sovereignty, Persephone became a symbol of balance. To close one's eyes and drift into sleep, listening to her tale, is to be reminded that change is not always a loss. Sometimes, transformation carries with it a kind of quiet majesty. Persephone's journey into the underworld was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her reign, a reign that continues to echo through mythology, reminding us of the beauty found even in the shadowed places. While Persephone adjusted to her new role within the silent halls of the underworld, the world above felt the weight of her absence. The grief of her mother, Demeter, spread across the earth like a heavy veil, and from that sorrow emerged something the world had never known before: winter. To the ancients, this was not a natural season of cold and snow as we understand it today. It was an expression of divine despair, the direct result of a mother's mourning. Demeter, goddess of the harvest and fertility, had always been associated with abundance. Wherever her presence lingered, crops grew tall, the soil remained rich, and mortals thrived under her favor. But when Persephone vanished, Her joy turned to bitterness, and the life-giving power she once generously offered was withdrawn. In myth, Demeter wandered the earth searching for her daughter, her golden torch lighting the way through forests, mountains, and plains. Each step she took carried with it a sense of sorrow, and the ground beneath her began to wither. Wheat fields that once shone like sunlight bent and collapsed. Vineyards dried into brittle twigs, and the fertile earth became barren. The gods observed this change with unease. Mortals began to starve, their prayers rising into the heavens, asking for relief. Sacrifices grew fewer as famine spread. Even Zeus, high upon Olympus, could not ignore the devastation. Yet still, Demeter refused to let go of her grief. She would not allow the earth to flourish while her daughter remained in darkness. Her refusal was an act of divine will, a statement that nothing, not even the might of Olympus, could heal the wound of a mother's loss. In many accounts, Demeter disguised herself as an old woman and wandered among mortals during this time. She was said to have arrived in Eleusis, a humble city, where she was welcomed into the home of a kind family. There, her sorrow was both hidden and revealed. She tried to serve in her disguise, but her overwhelming grief could not be contained. Even in mortal form, her divine essence leaked through. The hearth she sat upon glowed unnaturally bright, and the family soon realized they were hosting no ordinary woman. This episode became the foundation of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of sacred rites that promised initiates a deeper understanding of life, death, and rebirth, rituals forever tied to the story of Demeter and Persephone. But the wider world was still suffering. As famine gripped humanity, it became clear that no crops would grow, no trees would bear fruit, and no animals would thrive unless Persephone was restored. Demeter's grief had created an imbalance so profound that even the eternal cycle of nature was halted. It was said that mortals began to fear true extinction, that without Persephone's return, life itself would wither away. The mythic image of the first winter is haunting. Imagine fields lying bare beneath a gray sky, rivers slowing into silence, the breath of mortals visible in the cold. No flowers bloomed to signal renewal, no birds sang their familiar songs. Even the gods, untouched by hunger, could feel the emptiness stretching across the earth. All of this was not born of natural cycles, but from Demeter's refusal to let go. Her love for her daughter had reshaped creation, turning warmth into cold, plenty into scarcity. It is in this moment that the myth carries its deepest symbolic weight. The first winter becomes a metaphor for grief itself. Just as the earth froze under Demeter's sorrow, so too does grief in our own lives halt growth, drain color, and make time feel suspended. The ancient storytellers, in weaving this imagery, offered listeners a way to understand loss through the natural world. Winter is not permanent, they remind us. It is a season. And so too is mourning. But in that first mythic winter, Demeter did not yet know this. To her, grief was endless. Zeus, pressured by the cries of mortals and the distress of the other gods, finally intervened. He sent Hermes, the swift messenger, down to the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. This moment carried immense tension, for the underworld was not easily persuaded, and Persephone had already eaten of the pomegranate. Still, Demeter's grief could not be ignored. Without some resolution, all creation would collapse. In storytelling tradition, this episode is often told with a sense of solemn inevitability. The gods, though powerful, were themselves bound by the emotions that define existence: grief, longing, and love. Demeter's mourning showed that even divinities were not immune to sorrow, and that the bonds between mother and child could shape not only lives, but entire worlds. The first winter thus became more than a mythic event. It became an explanation for a cycle that every generation of humans would come to know. It was a reminder that abundance cannot last unbroken, that there are times when life must pause, when the earth itself seems to grieve. And yet, beneath the frost, there is always the promise of renewal. In that promise, the myth gently reassures its listeners. No season of loss endures forever. As you drift further into the story, picture the earth cloaked in silence, the fields bare, the trees skeletal against the sky. Imagine Demeter's figure wandering across that frozen world, her torch held aloft, her eyes searching the horizon for a glimpse of her beloved daughter. The stillness of the landscape mirrors her heart, and the hush of winter echoes the soundless ache of separation. This is the grief that gave birth to the seasons, a sorrow so deep that it reshaped the world, teaching mortals and gods alike that love is both powerful and perilous. And so, the first winter was not merely a season of cold. It was a story written into the fabric of existence, a tale of loss and love, of cycles and returns, reminding us that even in darkness, the memory of spring waits quietly to bloom again. As Demeter's sorrow lingered and the world above continued to wither, the gods found themselves at an impasse. The cries of mortals had reached Olympus, their sacrifices dwindling, their voices growing weaker with hunger. Even Zeus, so often distant from mortal concerns, could no longer ignore the silence rising from the earth. To save humanity, something had to be done. And so he sent Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger, down to the shadowed halls of Hades with a mission that would alter the cycle of life forever. The underworld was no easy place to negotiate. Its gates, guarded by Cerberus, opened only for those destined to pass into death, and its ruler, Hades, was not known for yielding to the will of others. Hermes descended with words of compromise, carrying Zeus's decree that Persephone must return, at least in part, to her grieving mother. For without her, the world would remain frozen, barren, and silent. Hades listened, but as Hermes spoke, he revealed a truth that would change everything. Persephone had eaten the seeds of the pomegranate. To mortals, this might have seemed a trivial detail, a mere taste of fruit. But in the language of myth, it was a binding act, a ritual of permanence. To eat the food of the underworld was to accept its laws, to be tied to it in spirit and body. Persephone, whether willingly or not, had sealed a bond with Hades's realm. The pomegranate, with its crimson seeds, is a symbol layered with meaning. Its abundance of seeds reflects fertility, growth, and life's continuation, yet its blood-red juice carries the shadow of mortality and binding fate. By consuming it, Persephone became more than a passerby in the land of the dead. She became part of it, her life tethered forever to the shadows. In some versions of the myth, she ate just a few seeds, sometimes 6, sometimes 4. In others, Hades offered them as a gesture of love, while in still others, it was a clever trick to ensure she could never fully leave him. Whatever the version, the outcome was the same. Persephone could no longer be wholly restored to her mother. When Hermes carried this revelation back to Demeter, her grief deepened. She had hoped for a complete reunion, for her daughter to be returned untouched, free to walk the fields and scatter flowers as before. Yet now, the bargain was complicated. The fates themselves had spoken. Persephone belonged to both worlds. She could not remain forever in the sunlight, nor forever in the shadows. A compromise would have to be made. And so, the great bargain of the pomegranate seeds was struck. For part of the year, Persephone would remain in the underworld, seated beside Hades as its queen. For the other part, she would ascend to the surface, to be with her mother, to walk the fields and bring forth spring. The exact division varies in different tellings. Some say she spent 6 months below and 6 above, marking the long winter and long summer. Others claim she remained underground for only a third of the year, returning for 2/3 to Demeter's side. But whatever the division, the cycle was born. Persephone's descent brought autumn and winter, and her return heralded spring and summer. This bargain is not just an explanation for the seasons, it is also a lesson in balance. The myth suggests that even the gods must live within cycles of loss and return, absence and reunion. Persephone could not belong wholly to her mother, nor wholly to her husband. Instead, she became the bridge between worlds, embodying both the renewal of life and the inevitability of death. For the ancients, this story carried profound meaning. It was not only a tale of cosmic order, but also a reflection of human experience. Just as the earth cycles through abundance and barrenness, so too do human lives cycle through joy and grief, presence and absence. Persephone's fate mirrored the rhythms that mortals saw all around them, making the myth both a divine story and a universal truth. In the quiet chambers of the underworld, Persephone may have held the pomegranate seeds in her hand, their jeweled surfaces glistening like drops of blood or clusters of stars. Eating them tied her to the shadows, but it also gave her agency, transforming her from a powerless maiden into a queen whose presence reshaped the very earth above. To many storytellers, this act was not only a trick of Hades but also a choice by Persephone, an acceptance of her dual destiny. By tasting the fruit, she embraced the paradox of her existence, to live in both light and darkness, to carry both death and life within her. As the bargain was finalized, the gods watched with solemn acceptance. Demeter, though still grieving, understood that her daughter would at least return to her for part of the year, and with that promise, she allowed the earth to thaw. Fields slowly brightened, crops stirred back to life, and mortals, once desperate, felt hope return. The silence of famine was broken by the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds. And so, the world learned its rhythm. The joy of Persephone's presence, followed by the sorrow of her absence, an eternal cycle written into the fabric of time. In this way, the myth of the pomegranate seeds became one of the most enduring in Greek tradition. It offered not only an explanation for why seasons turn, but also a meditation on the inevitability of compromise, the weight of choices, and the eternal balance between gain and loss. To listen to it by lamplight or as one drifts toward sleep is to hear the heartbeat of existence itself, steady, cyclical, always moving from light into shadow and back again. With the bargain of the pomegranate sealed, the world entered into a rhythm that would never be broken. Persephone's time was now divided, part of the year in the warm embrace of her mother, and part of the year in the silent halls of the underworld beside Hades. This compromise did more than soothe the grief of gods. It gave shape to the turning of the seasons, a pattern that mortals would come to know as the heartbeat of the earth itself. When Persephone returned to the world above, Demeter's joy burst forth into the land. Grasses grew green and thick, trees bent with blossoms, and fields swelled with golden crops. Flowers opened in riotous color, their petals seeming to mirror the joy of the goddess as she welcomed her daughter back into her arms. Mortals, too, felt the change. They harvested, celebrated, and feasted, knowing that the presence of Persephone brought with it renewal and abundance. This was spring and summer, the seasons of warmth, fertility, and life. But when the time came for Persephone to descend once again into the underworld, Demeter's sorrow returned. The fields grew quiet, the air grew colder, and the once bright world dimmed into shades of gray and brown. Crops withered, leaves fell, and the earth seemed to grieve along with the goddess. Mortals, in turn, felt the chill of her sorrow, huddling through autumn and winter, waiting patiently for Persephone's return. In this way, the myth explained the cycle that governed all living things, the rhythm of birth and death, growth and decay, light and shadow. To the ancient Greeks, this was more than a charming story to explain natural change. It was a reminder that all of life is cyclical. Just as day gives way to night, and night to day, so too does joy give way to sorrow, and sorrow to joy. Nothing is permanent, and in that impermanence lies the beauty of existence. Persephone's movements taught mortals that loss is not final, that even when life seems barren and cold, renewal waits beneath the soil. The seasons were not random but purposeful, each carrying lessons to be embraced. The cycle of Persephone was also mirrored in the lives of mortals. Childhood and youth, like spring and summer, are times of abundance, growth, and light. But adulthood and age, like autumn and winter, bring change, decline, and eventual rest. Just as Persephone never truly left either realm, mortals lived with both vitality and mortality within them. Her story was a reflection of their own lives, woven into the turning of the year. This connection between the myth and human existence was celebrated in the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rituals that promised initiates insight into life, death, and rebirth. Those who participated were taught that death was not the end but a passage, just as Persephone's descent was not eternal absence but a stage in a cycle. To live was to die, and to die was to prepare for renewal. Persephone's movements gave spiritual meaning to the natural world, transforming the harshness of winter into a season of waiting and the joy of spring into a reminder of eternal return. In art and poetry, Persephone became the image of duality. In one hand, she held blossoms and sheaves of grain, symbols of life's richness. In the other, she carried the pomegranate or the torch, reminders of her reign in the underworld. Her very presence embodied balance. She was never only the maiden nor only the queen, she was always both. And so, the cycle of seasons became not just about nature but about the soul, its light and its shadow, its joys and its sorrows, its inevitable transformations. For those who lived by the harvest, this myth offered comfort. Farmers who sowed seeds in the fall, burying them in cold earth, believed that Persephone's return would awaken them into new life. The rhythm of agriculture became a mirror of her journey, seeds resting like Persephone in the underworld, sprouting like her joyful return in spring. Each year, as they tilled, planted, and reaped, they were participating in the cycle of the goddess herself. Even for those who were not farmers, the myth carried meaning. It reminded people that sorrow does not last forever, and that joy, too, is fleeting. It taught patience, resilience, and reverence for the unseen forces that shape existence. In Persephone's story, they found the reassurance that the frost would thaw, the flowers would bloom again, and life, no matter how dark the winter, would always return. To imagine the cycle is to picture the world as an eternal wheel, turning slowly but inevitably. On one side of the wheel lies warmth, light, and renewal. On the other, silence, rest, and stillness. Persephone's footsteps move the wheel forward, guiding mortals through each turn. Her departure into shadow is not abandonment, but a reminder of the necessity of pause. Her return to the light is not merely joy, but a promise of continuity. As you drift with this story, it becomes clear that Persephone's myth is not a tale locked in the distant past. It is still alive, in the blossoming of spring after the long sleep of winter, in the cycles of our own lives as we move through joy, loss, and renewal. Her journey is the journey of all existence, written into the turning of the earth, the rising and setting of the sun, the beating of the human heart. And so, the cycle of seasons and human life are bound together in her name. Persephone is both a goddess of renewal and a queen of endings, both a child of spring and a ruler of shadows. To listen to her story as sleep approaches is to be reminded that even in our darkest hours, there is light waiting to return. Just as the earth rests before it blooms, so too do we rest before we awaken anew. With her life now bound to both realms, Persephone came to embody more than the turning of the seasons. She became a guide, a goddess who could move freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead, carrying messages, comfort, and meaning across the boundary that few could ever cross. This role transformed her from a figure of sorrow into one of deep spiritual significance, not only to the gods, but to mortals who looked to her as a bridge between existence and eternity. For the Greeks, the underworld was not only a place of shadows and silence. It was also the destination of every mortal soul. To know that a goddess walked between those lands offered reassurance. Persephone was not only a ruler, but also a companion to the dead. Her presence suggested that no soul entered darkness alone. Instead, they would pass into a realm watched over by a queen who had herself once known the brightness of the sun and the tenderness of love. In this sense, Persephone became a psychopomp, a guide of souls, though she was not the only one in Greek myth. Hermes, too, served as a conductor of the dead. But where Hermes brought swiftness and detachment, Persephone carried with her empathy, a sense of understanding that made her role unique. She was the goddess who had experienced both sides of existence and could therefore serve as a mediator between them. In stories, her gaze was said to be gentle but unwavering, her presence both comforting and solemn, reminding the departed that death was not erasure but transition. This idea was most powerfully expressed in the Eleusinian mysteries, the secret rites performed in her honor and that of her mother, Demeter. Participants in these rituals believed that Persephone could grant them insight into the mysteries of life and death, offering hope that death was not a final end. Her journey between worlds became a sacred map, showing that descent could be followed by ascent, that what falls into darkness may rise again into light. To those who entered the mysteries, Persephone was more than a myth, she was a promise. Her dual role also made her a figure of balance. As queen of the underworld, she sat in judgment alongside Hades, lending fairness and compassion to decisions about the souls of mortals. As daughter of Demeter, she embodied renewal, life, and the fertility of the earth. She held in her being both the severity of endings and the gentleness of beginnings. In this way, Persephone was not only a guide for the dead but also for the living, showing that all of existence must walk with both shadow and light. To imagine Persephone as a guide is to see her walking along the banks of the Styx, the silent river that marked the edge of Hades's realm. Souls, uncertain and trembling, would follow her steps as she led them toward their destinies. In her presence, their fears softened. She had known the warmth of fields and the scent of blossoms. She carried that memory with her into the shadows. To those who listened, she might whisper that darkness was not an exile but a resting place, that life and death were woven together like threads in a single cloth. In poetry and art, Persephone is often depicted holding a torch. This flame, small but steady, symbolizes her role as guide. In the darkness of the underworld, the torch lit the way for souls who otherwise would have wandered in confusion. It also symbolized knowledge, the illumination of mysteries hidden from ordinary sight. To see Persephone holding a torch was to be reminded that even in death, there is a light that does not fade. Her role as guide also extended into dreams and visions. Many believed that Persephone could send messages to the living from the underworld, appearing in sleep to deliver omens or insights. In this way, she connected not only the realms of life and death, but also the conscious and unconscious. To dream of Persephone was to receive wisdom from beyond the veil, a whisper of the eternal cycle that shaped all things. But her guidance was not always gentle. As queen of the underworld, Persephone carried authority, and her presence reminded mortals of the inevitability of death. Yet even this stern aspect of her role was not meant to terrify, but to instruct. To live fully, one must remember the shadow, for it gives shape and meaning to the light. Persephone's guidance was thus both a comfort and a challenge. She urged mortals to embrace the whole of existence, not only its joys but also its sorrows, not only its beginnings but also its endings. For the ancient listener, drifting by firelight or under the stars, Persephone's story was more than distant mythology. It was a way to frame the most profound human questions. What happens after death? What lies in the silence beyond life? Can there be renewal after loss? Persephone, with her endless passage between the two realms, provided an answer. She embodied the assurance that nothing truly ends, that every descent is followed by a return, and that the soul, like the seasons, is part of a greater cycle. As you listen now, perhaps with eyes heavy and thoughts softening, imagine Persephone herself walking quietly at the edge of two worlds. Her steps are steady, her torch glowing faintly in the dark. She does not rush. She moves with calm, guiding not only the souls of the departed, but also the hearts of the living who hear her story. She is the goddess who holds our fears of endings and transforms them into gentle reminders of renewal. In her presence, the veil between life and death seems thinner, less frightening, more like a doorway than a wall. And so, Persephone as a guide between worlds is more than myth. She is the embodiment of hope in the face of endings, of balance in the face of extremes, of continuity in the face of change. To close your eyes and imagine her is to feel that whatever shadows may come, there will always be a path and always a light to follow. The myth of Hades and Persephone is more than a story of gods, a cycle of seasons, or a tale whispered around hearths long ago. It is a story layered with lessons, a narrative that threads together themes of love, loss, resilience, and the eternal balance between opposites. To reflect on it is to listen to a kind of ancient wisdom, a wisdom that, even after thousands of years, continues to speak softly to us in the quiet of the night. One of the first lessons lies in the inevitability of change. Persephone's abduction may seem harsh, a sudden tearing away from the world she knew, but it echoes a truth recognized by every listener. That life shifts without warning, and what feels certain can be altered in a single moment. Just as the seasons turn, so too do our lives, moving from spring's brightness to winter's stillness. Persephone reminds us that even when change feels like loss, there is always the possibility of return, of renewal, of finding light again after shadow. Another lesson is that sorrow and joy are not separate but intertwined. Demeter's grief brings famine, while Persephone's return brings fertility. The myth does not allow us to imagine a world of endless summer, nor one of endless winter. Instead, it tells us that joy gains meaning because sorrow exists beside it. Just as flowers bloom only to fade, only to bloom again, our own lives are shaped by cycles of happiness and grief. Persephone embodies this truth, teaching that to embrace both is to live fully. There is also a lesson in acceptance. For Persephone, the pomegranate seeds tied her to the underworld. What could have been seen only as a curse became, with time, a mark of her identity. She learned to reign in the underworld with dignity, to embrace her role as queen rather than remain a captive in sorrow. This shift holds a quiet teaching, that what first feels like burden can, through patience, transform into strength. Sometimes, we must carry both light and shadow, not as contradictions, but as parts of a whole. For mortals who told and retold this myth, Persephone was also a reminder of resilience. She did not vanish when taken to Hades' realm. She adapted, she endured, and in doing so, she came to wield her own power. The lesson here is gentle but profound, that we, too, can endure the seasons of our lives, even the winters of the spirit, and that through endurance, we discover new forms of strength. The myth also carries lessons about the power of love and its consequences. Demeter's love for Persephone shook the heavens and the earth, stalling growth and bringing famine. It shows the strength of bonds between parent and child, the unyielding force of affection that no god, not even Zeus, could ignore. Yet it also shows that love can bring suffering when it clings too tightly. Balance was required, not endless possession. The compromise that allowed Persephone to walk between two worlds was a reminder that love, to endure, must sometimes let go, even if only for a season. Hades' role in the story carries a lesson as well, though it is more complex. His act of taking Persephone was born of desire, yet it reshaped the destiny of gods and mortals alike. His presence in the tale reminds us of the shadow within love, the force of passion that can take without asking. In this way, the story becomes not only a myth of seasons, but also a meditation on choice, consent, and the balance between desire and respect. For the Greeks, the tale also held sacred lessons about death. Persephone's descent into the underworld was not simply a tragedy, but a guide for all mortals who would one day face the same journey. Her return each spring was assurance that what goes down may rise again, that death is not the end, but part of a larger cycle. To close one's eyes and listen to Persephone's story was to hear that endings are not final, but woven into beginnings yet to come. Even today, when the fields are not sown with offerings to Demeter and Persephone, these lessons endure. The myth reminds us to welcome change, to see endings not only as losses but as transitions. It teaches us to accept sorrow without despair, to recognize that light always waits at the far edge of darkness. It suggests that our deepest bonds, though they may bring pain, also bring renewal and meaning. As you rest and reflect, you may find that Persephone's lessons echo within your own life. Perhaps you recall moments of sudden change, when something precious was lost, and yet in time, something new was found. Perhaps you remember winters of spirit, when joy seemed distant, only to return later with surprising warmth. In such memories, you may see that the myth is not only ancient history, but also a mirror of your own journey. To listen to Persephone's tale in the stillness of night is to let her lessons seep quietly into the heart. She whispers that loss does not last forever, that even when we feel bound to shadows, spring will come. She reminds us that what we resist may become part of us, and that in accepting both light and dark, we find balance. And she shows us that love, though sometimes marked by absence, always leaves traces strong enough to shape the very world. So, as the story draws nearer to its end, the lessons of Persephone remain. They do not demand urgency, nor do they stir restless thought. Instead, they settle gently, like the hush of snowfall or the warmth of sunlight returning after frost. They linger quietly, waiting, ready to be remembered when life's cycles turn again. And in this soft remembering, you may drift into your own kind of rest, carrying with you the calm assurance that endings are never truly endings, and beginnings are always closer than they seem. Though the tale of Hades and Persephone comes from an age of temples, torches, and whispered prayers to unseen gods, its echoes still linger in the modern world. Across centuries, the story has been retold, reshaped, and reimagined, woven into literature, art, psychology, and even everyday reflections about change, love, and identity. It may be ancient, yet it is also timeless, its roots planted deep, still sending out new shoots that touch the lives of those who hear it today. In literature, Persephone appears as a symbol of transformation. Writers have drawn on her descent into the underworld to explore themes of personal struggle, growth, and the resilience of the human spirit. To read a novel that invokes Persephone is often to find a character who faces darkness, who is forced into an unfamiliar place, and who emerges with newfound strength. In this way, the myth becomes a language for speaking about the journeys we all take, whether they are emotional, spiritual, or deeply personal. In art, the image of Persephone has been painted again and again. Sometimes she is shown as the innocent maiden, arms outstretched as flowers fall from her hands. At other times, she is the stern queen, seated beside Hades with a crown upon her brow. These depictions reflect the duality that she embodies: life and death, light and shadow, loss and renewal. For the viewer, to see her face in art is to be reminded of the many roles we play, the many stages of being human, and the way we, too, move between different worlds within ourselves. Psychology has also embraced the myth, especially in the work of thinkers like Carl Jung and those who followed him. Persephone has been seen as an archetype, representing the inner journey of descent and return, the confrontation with the unconscious, and the discovery of hidden strengths. To dream of Persephone is, in this sense, to dream of one's own capacity to navigate darkness and emerge transformed. The story, though ancient, becomes a map for modern minds exploring their own depths. Even in popular culture, the myth continues to appear. Films, novels, plays, and even modern retellings in songs or graphic novels return again and again to the image of the maiden and the underworld. Some versions soften the tale, turning it into a romance where Persephone chooses Hades freely. Others preserve its harsher edges, emphasizing loss, captivity, and compromise. Each retelling reflects the concerns of its own time, but the fact that the myth remains so often reimagined shows how deeply it still resonates. Beyond art and story, the myth's lessons find their way into everyday reflection. The cycles of the seasons continue, even in modern cities where fields are fewer and technology often distances us from the land. Yet still, we notice the lengthening of days and the darkening of nights, the blooming and fading of flowers, the shift of warmth into cold. In these changes, Persephone's journey continues to echo. Each spring feels like her return, each autumn her descent. Without needing to know her name, people still live within the rhythm her myth describes. On a more personal level, the myth speaks to those who have faced loss or endured periods of struggle. To remember Persephone is to remember that even after a winter of the heart, spring can come again. Her story gives form to feelings that otherwise might remain wordless: the ache of absence, the patience of waiting, the joy of reunion, the resilience of survival. In this way, the myth continues to offer comfort, a quiet assurance that cycles of darkness are not endless, and that renewal always follows. The myth also resonates in discussions of identity and power. Persephone's role as both maiden and queen reflects the way people grow into new selves, sometimes through trials they would not have chosen. Her story becomes a metaphor for claiming one's strength, for learning to carry both vulnerability and authority. In a world where individuals still seek to define themselves, Persephone remains a guide, showing that transformation is possible and that the journey through shadow can lead to unexpected empowerment. Modern spiritual practices, too, sometimes draw upon Persephone's story. For those who follow nature-based paths, she is seen as a goddess of cycles, of descent into introspection and return into growth. Meditation on her myth is used as a way to embrace personal transformation, to release what must fall away, and to welcome what returns. The very act of reflecting on Persephone becomes a ritual, a way to mark one's own inner seasons. Even in everyday language, the myth has left its mark. To speak of a descent into the underworld or of emerging into the light is to echo Persephone's path. These phrases capture the essence of her tale and carry it forward into moments that are far removed from temples or sacrifices. They remind us that the language of myth is not locked in the past, but lives on, shaping how we describe our own experiences. As you listen now, in the quiet of this moment, you may notice how these modern echoes settle gently in your mind. Perhaps you see how Persephone's story mirrors your own experiences of change, or perhaps you simply hear the calm reminder that ancient wisdom still lives all around us, hidden in art, in seasons, in the words we speak, and in the very rhythm of life. And so, the myth of Hades and Persephone, though born long ago, continues to breathe softly into the present. It reminds us that even in an age of bright lights and restless motion, the old stories still have the power to guide us, to comfort us, and to help us understand who we are. Their echoes are not fading but enduring, woven quietly into the world we know. As you drift deeper into rest, let these echoes accompany you, soft and timeless, like the gentle return of spring after winter's hush. And now, as the story draws to a gentle close, we return to the quiet where it all began. The tale of Hades and Persephone has carried us through fields of sunlight and into the depths of shadow, across the turning of seasons and the timeless rhythms of love, loss, and return. It has been a journey that touched on the innocence of springtime, the sorrow of absence, the resilience of survival, and the hope of renewal. Each part of the story, woven together, has left us with echoes that linger softly, like the fading notes of a lullaby. Take a moment to let the story settle within you. Imagine the fields of the earth, wide and endless, waiting for the return of Persephone's step. See the underworld, silent and still, watched over by a queen who carries both shadow and light in her gaze. Feel the cycles moving quietly within yourself, the small changes of breath and heartbeat, the way each inhale is followed by an exhale, each moment of wakefulness by the promise of rest. The myth has been a mirror of these cycles, and now, in this quiet reflection, you may find yourself ready to embrace your own season of stillness, your night of rest. The closing of this tale is not truly an ending, for Persephone's journey is eternal. She will rise again, she will descend again, and each cycle will carry with it the lessons we have spoken of. That change is inevitable, that sorrow and joy live side by side, that renewal follows loss. In this way, her story is like the steady rhythm of sleep itself. Each night a small descent, each morning a return. To rest is to echo Persephone, to step gently into darkness not as an end, but as a passage into renewal. As you listen, let your mind soften around the edges. You may picture Persephone herself, walking quietly along the border of two worlds, her torch glowing faintly in her hand. She does not rush, she does not falter. Her pace is steady, measured, timeless. With every step, she carries the assurance that there is no need for fear, for each descent into shadow leads, in time, to the light. Let this image guide you, as though she were leading you gently into your own underworld of dreams, a realm not of fear, but of peace. Perhaps you imagine the underworld not as a place of dread, but as a place of calm, a vast cavern where rivers flow in silence, where the air is cool and still, where time itself seems to pause. Within it, Persephone walks with quiet grace, and with her presence, the darkness does not feel heavy but comforting, like a blanket drawn around the shoulders. The souls who follow her are at ease, and so too can you be, as you follow her into your own night's rest. The world above continues its cycle. In distant fields, flowers sleep beneath the soil, waiting for the warmth of spring. The trees stand quiet in the cool night air. The stars turn slowly in the sky, their light steady, ancient, and calm. In this vast and endless rhythm, your own rest becomes part of something larger. You are not separate from these cycles, but within them, carried by the same flow of renewal that moves Persephone between realms. As your thoughts drift, you may notice them becoming softer, like leaves carried downstream. You do not need to hold them tightly. Let them pass, let them fall away, until only quiet remains. The story has given you all it needed to give: images of light and shadow, lessons of resilience, reminders of balance. Now, it is time to let go of the words themselves, to allow them to dissolve into silence, leaving only calm within you. Your body, too, follows this rhythm. With each breath, you descend a little deeper into rest. Inhale, like the arrival of spring, fresh and renewing. Exhale, like the fading of autumn, soft and releasing. Each cycle of breath is a reflection of Persephone's journey. Each pause between breaths a moment of stillness, a reminder that rest is not an absence, but a passage into something nurturing and necessary. You may notice your eyelids heavy now, your body sinking deeper into the surface beneath you. The story has carried you to this moment, like a gentle tide bringing a boat to shore. There is no need to resist. Rest welcomes you as surely as Persephone welcomes each soul into the underworld, not as an end, but as a continuation, a gentle transition. As you surrender to this rest, remember that you carry with you the lessons of the tale. That change is natural, that endings are not final, that love endures even in absence, that light waits beyond every shadow. These truths settle quietly in your heart, requiring no effort, no thought, simply existing there as a calm presence. And now, as night deepens around you, allow yourself to step fully into your own underworld of dreams. Persephone's torch still glows, lighting the way, but you may not need it for long. Soon, you will drift beyond even images and words, into the silence where the mind rests and the body renews. You are safe here, within the rhythm of the story, within the embrace of the night, within the endless cycle of descent and return. Sleep, like Persephone's journey, is not a vanishing but a passage. You enter it gently, and you will return renewed. Let the rhythm of breath carry you there. Let the quiet of the night enfold you. Let the story dissolve into dream. And so, the tale of Hades and Persephone comes to rest, not with an ending, but with a promise, that after every descent, there is a return, that after every shadow, there is light, and that even in the deepest silence, you are held in the gentle cycle of life's eternal turning. Now, let yourself drift, softly, peacefully, into sleep. And now, with the story fully told, we arrive at the quietest part of the night. The tale of Persephone has walked us through light and darkness, through loss and renewal, through the endless cycles of change that touch not only the earth, but also the heart. What remains now is not the sound of words, but the hush that follows them, a silence filled with calm. Imagine Persephone herself standing at the edge of both realms, her torch held loosely in her hand, its flame steady but soft. She looks back toward you, offering not command but comfort, not urgency but reassurance. Her gaze tells you what the story itself has been saying all along, that every ending is a beginning, that every descent is followed by return, that even in stillness, life continues quietly. As you rest here, the weight of wakefulness loosening, allow the story to dissolve into dream. You no longer need to carry its details, for they will remain, like seeds beneath the soil, ready to return when you need them again. For now, only the feeling matters, the sense of being held within a timeless rhythm, the comfort of knowing you are part of something enduring, something gentle, something vast. The night stretches around you like a protective cloak. The world outside grows quieter, slower, softer. Within this stillness, your own breath moves in steady rhythm. Each inhale a reminder of renewal, each exhale a release of the day's weight. You are safe here, at the close of story and the beginning of sleep, walking your own path alongside Persephone into a realm of rest. Let the final whisper of this tale accompany you into dreams. Carry with you the calm assurance that light will return, that cycles will continue, and that you, too, are part of this eternal turning. The torch fades, the fields lie waiting, the stars shine faintly above. And you, at last, are ready to drift. Good night.